The moment Dorothy Morgan walked through the doors of the Millfield General Store on that sweltering August afternoon in 1882, she knew something was terribly wrong. The room went silent, not the comfortable kind of quiet that settles when a door swings open and the summer heat rolls in with it. This was the suffocating kind, the kind that presses down on your chest like a stone, the kind that comes when 50 pairs of eyes slide away from you all at once, as though looking directly at you might burn them. Women clutched their shopping baskets tighter. Men tilted their hat brims down. Children were tugged behind their mothers' skirts. Dorothy stopped walking. She stood in the center of the doorway, the afternoon sun painting her shadow long across the floorboards, and she felt the exact shape of her own ruin before she understood a single word of it. Then she saw Mabel Pritchard. Mabel was standing near the bolt fabric counter with a small crowd gathered around her, and the expression on Mabel's face was the one that Dorothy had learned to fear more than drought, more than rattlesnakes, more than the memory of her dead husband's debts. It was a look of supreme, glittering satisfaction, the look of a woman who had just lit a fuse and was watching the flame crawl toward the powder. "Well," Mabel said, her voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room, loud enough to be heard even by old Mr. Cavanaugh, who had been deaf in one ear since the war. "Speak of the devil herself." Dorothy's chin came up. She had practiced that, the reflex of pride when what she truly felt was fear. 3 years of widowhood in a town that had never quite accepted her had taught her that much. "Mabel," Dorothy said, and her voice came out steady enough that she was privately grateful for it. "I was just telling everyone," Mabel continued, smoothing her gloved hands across the counter with theatrical leisure, "about the letter." Dorothy did not know what letter. She did not have to know. She could see from the faces around her that whatever the letter contained, it had already done its work. She could see it in the way Pastor Holt's wife turned her face away. She could see it in the way young Clara Briggs, who had been Dorothy's closest acquaintance since Dorothy arrived in Millfield, pressed her lips together and would not quite meet her eyes. "I don't know what letter you're referring to," Dorothy said, because it was the truth. "Of course you don't," Mabel said pleasantly, which was somehow worse than cruelty. "You were hoping no one would find out, weren't you, about where you really came from, about what you really are?" The word hung in the air between them like smoke. It was in that precise, frozen moment, when Dorothy felt the ground of her quiet, carefully constructed life beginning to crack and fall away beneath her feet, that the door behind her opened again. She felt the shift in the room before she turned, felt it in the way the air changed, in the way the crowd's attention suddenly divided and recalibrated. She turned. Sheriff Ezekiel Chandler stood in the doorway. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going silver at the temples even though he was only 34 years old. He wore a deputy's star on his chest that had been replaced last spring with the full sheriff's badge after the previous man retired. He had a face that was not precisely handsome in the conventional way, but was the kind of face that people looked at and did not easily look away from, angular and serious, with dark brown eyes that took in a room the way a careful man takes inventory of what he owns. He looked at the room, just that. He looked at it. His gaze moved slowly from Mabel Pritchard at the counter, to the gathered crowd, to the women with their baskets, to the men with their tilted hats, and then it settled on Dorothy Morgan's face where it stayed. Something in the room changed. It was not a sound. It was not a word. It was simply a quality of attention that shifted, the way a compass needle swings when true north is suddenly introduced. The crowd that had been leaning toward Mabel Pritchard like flowers toward sunlight quietly, almost imperceptibly, straightened. Mabel's mouth opened to continue. Then she looked at Ezekiel Chandler's face, and she closed it again. The silence stretched. Ezekiel Chandler walked into the store. He walked at an unhurried pace, boots easy on the floorboards, and he tipped his hat to Mrs. Holt and to old Mr. Cavanaugh and to 2 ranchers near the door, and then he walked straight to the counter where Dorothy Morgan stood, and he said quietly and with absolute certainty, "Miss Dorothy, good afternoon. Did you get the supplies you needed?" It was such an ordinary sentence. It was so completely, deliberately ordinary that it took the entire venom out of the moment as surely as if he had picked up the fuse and pinched the flame between his fingers. Dorothy stared at him for half a second too long. "Not yet," she said, because the alternative was not speaking at all, and she would not give Mabel Pritchard that victory. "I'll wait," Ezekiel said, and he turned to face the room with his back to the counter, his arms loose at his sides, his eyes calm and clear and watchful, and the message was so simple and so unmistakable that even the children understood it. Whatever was happening here is finished now. Mabel Pritchard gathered her things and left, and the crowd dissolved around her, and the color slowly came back into the room like sunlight returning after a cloud, and Dorothy Morgan stood at the counter and placed her order with hands that were almost perfectly steady, and she did not cry until she was safely home with the door latched behind her. She cried for a long time. Then she sat down at her kitchen table, poured herself a cup of coffee that had gone cold on the stove, and asked herself how she had arrived at this particular crossroads, in this particular town, with this particular enemy who had just tried to unmake everything she had built. The answer required going back 18 months. Back to the morning Dorothy Morgan had stepped off the westbound train at Millfield Station with 2 trunks, a carpet bag, a signed lease agreement for the small house on Willow Street, and exactly $4.30 in her purse. She had come from St. Louis. Before St. Louis, she had come from a small town in Missouri called Caldwell Crossing, where she had been born Dorothy Eames, the second of 4 daughters to a schoolteacher father and a mother who made excellent preserves and died of fever when Dorothy was 12. She had married young, at 19, to a man named Thomas Morgan who had seemed steady and kind, and had turned out to be steady and kind in ways that mattered and ruinously careless in ways that mattered more. Thomas had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1880, which was a grief. Thomas had died with debts that dwarfed his estate by a factor that Dorothy still did not like to calculate, which was a catastrophe. Dorothy had spent 6 months in St. Louis working as a seamstress and a laundress, and once, desperately, as a hotel maid, paying down what she could and realizing she could not pay enough and that the city was slowly swallowing her whole. A notice in the St. Louis Dispatch had advertised a position in Millfield, Kansas. A widow with good character and domestic skills wanted to assist the proprietress of a boarding house. Dorothy had good character. She had more domestic skills than she had ever wanted. She had written a letter that same night and received a positive reply within 3 weeks, and she had packed her 2 trunks and her carpet bag and gotten on the train before she could allow herself to be afraid. The boarding house proprietress was a widow herself, Agnes Langley, a small, fierce woman of 60 who smelled of lavender water and tobacco, and whose arthritis had made the running of 4 boarders and a commercial kitchen more than her hands could manage alone. Dorothy had moved into the small back room, learned the rhythms of the house within a week, and by the end of the first month had taken over the bookkeeping, the meal planning, the supply ordering, and the management of the boarders with an efficiency that made Agnes Langley look at her speculatively over the dinner table. "You're wasted as a helper," Agnes had said, stabbing a piece of roast chicken with her fork. "You ought to have your own place." "I don't have the capital," Dorothy had said. "I do," Agnes had replied. "I have the house on Willow Street that I've been renting out to one disaster of a tenant after another. I'll lease it to you at a reasonable rate if you'll take over my kitchen supply contracts and stop working for me for free." It was not quite that simple, but it was not far off. Dorothy had spent 3 months converting the house on Willow Street into a modest but respectable establishment she called Morgan's Tea Room, which served midday meals to the town's business district Monday through Saturday, and offered a room for private dining on Sundays by arrangement. She had learned to bake the dense, sweet pies that Kansas appetites favored. She had learned the names and preferences of her regular customers. She had built, slowly and with enormous effort, a small and fragile thing called a reputation, which was, of course, exactly what Mabel Pritchard had set out to destroy. Mabel Pritchard was the wife of Garrett Pritchard, who owned the Millfield Savings and Trust and a considerable portion of the commercial property on Main Street, which meant that Mabel occupied the position in Millfield's social hierarchy that wealth always creates for the women attached to it, the position of absolute arbiter. Mabel decided who was respectable and who was not. Mabel determined which new arrivals were worth cultivating and which were to be merely tolerated. Mabel organized the Church Women's Society and the Independence Day Committee and the subscriptions for the new schoolhouse edition, and her approval was the coin of the realm in a way that Dorothy had recognized instantly and had worked carefully and patiently to court. For 12 months it had seemed to be working. Mabel had accepted Dorothy's pies at the church social. Mabel had sent her niece to take lessons in bread baking from Dorothy on Thursday afternoons. Mabel had even stopped by the tea room twice for midday meals and said the soup was acceptable, which, from Mabel Pritchard, was nearly the equivalent of a standing ovation. Dorothy had not understood, until it was much too late, that Mabel had not been cultivating her. Mabel had been investigating her. The specifics of what Mabel had found, or claimed to have found, or fabricated from the raw material of a few inconvenient facts, Dorothy did not learn all at once. She learned them in pieces over the days following the scene in the general store, the way a person learns the full extent of an injury only as the initial shock fades and the true pain emerges. She learned that Mabel had written a letter to a woman in St. Louis named Celeste Vane, who had once lived in the same boarding house neighborhood as Dorothy and who had particular reasons, which Dorothy would have described as malice and Celeste would have described differently, for painting Dorothy in an unflattering light. She learned that Celeste had replied with a long, detailed account of Dorothy's time in St. Louis that was constructed of just enough truth to make the lies in it nearly impossible to disprove. She learned that this account had described Dorothy Morgan as a woman of questionable moral character who had supported herself in St. Louis by means that a respectable widow should not have had available to her. This was false. It was a complete and deliberate falsification. Dorothy had supported herself in St. Louis by cleaning other people's rooms and mending other people's clothes, and occasionally sitting up through the night with sick boarders who needed someone and could not afford a nurse. She had done these things without complaint and without shame, and had considered them simply the mathematics of survival. But Celeste Vane's letter did not say that. Celeste Vane's letter, which Mabel had been reading aloud to selected members of Millfield's social circle for 2 days before she read it aloud in the general store, said something quite different. And in a town where reputation was the only currency a woman without property could spend, the lie was already buying its way into truth. Dorothy sat at her cold kitchen table and understood that she was ruined. She understood it the way you understand a sudden drop in temperature, not gradually but all at once, with the whole body. The following morning she opened the tea room at 7 as usual and served breakfast to the 3 regular boarders she kept, and she waited to see who would come for the midday meal. Half of her usual Thursday patrons came. The other half did not. She washed the dishes and reset the tables and kept her face composed and her thoughts orderly, and refused to count what this would cost her at the end of the month. At 2 in the afternoon, there was a knock at the back door. She opened it to find Sheriff Ezekiel Chandler standing in her kitchen garden with his hat in his hands. He was not a man she knew well. She knew him the way you know anyone in a small town, by sight, by the things people say, by the few exchanges that regular life produces. She knew he had been born in Texas and had come up through New Mexico before landing in Millfield. She knew he had been a deputy for 6 years before taking the badge in April. She knew he lived in the small house behind the jailhouse and ate most of his meals at the hotel dining room because there was no one to cook for him. She had not known that he would come to her back door with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face that was not pity, which she would not have been able to bear, but something careful and serious and direct. "Miss Dorothy," he said, "I wanted to see how you were getting on." She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said, because it was the polite thing and because, if she were honest with herself, she was desperately glad to see a face that was not turned away from her. He came in and stood in her kitchen, which smelled of bread and coffee, and he put his hat on the table and looked at her with those dark, serious eyes and said, "I want you to know that what Mabel Pritchard is doing is wrong." "It is," Dorothy agreed, setting the kettle on. "I also want you to know that I don't have a great deal of authority over what people say to one another," he continued. "If I did, Millfield would be a considerably quieter town. But what I do have authority over is what happens in public spaces, and I won't allow a woman to be publicly humiliated if I can prevent it." Dorothy set 2 cups on the table with great precision and said, "You did prevent it. Yesterday." "For the moment," he said. He sat down when she gestured, which meant he understood that she was not a fragile thing requiring to be managed, but a person having a conversation in her own kitchen. She appreciated that. "But I'm afraid that Mabel has been busy for longer than yesterday, and the story she's been telling has been circulating for a couple of days." "I know," Dorothy said. "I'm sorry," he said. "So am I," Dorothy said. They drank their coffee in a silence that was, unexpectedly, not uncomfortable. Dorothy had grown so accustomed to silences that felt like accusation that she had almost forgotten that silence could also feel like companionship. "Can you tell me," Ezekiel said eventually, setting his cup down and looking at her directly, "what happened in St. Louis? What Mabel has been saying? I mean, I don't know the facts of it and I'd like to." Dorothy looked at him for a moment. She measured the question, the intent behind it, the risk. "You want to know if any of it is true," she said. "No," he said, and something in his voice shifted into a register that was quiet and absolute. "I want to know what happened. There's a difference." She told him. She did not tell him everything because some things belonged to her alone, but she told him the shape of it. St. Louis, the cleaning and the mending and the sick boarders. Thomas's debts. Celeste Vane, who Dorothy had once inadvertently offended by reporting to the landlord that Celeste was keeping an unauthorized cat in her room, which in retrospect seemed like an extraordinary small act to generate this much consequence. Ezekiel listened without interrupting. He had the quality, which Dorothy would come to recognize as characteristic, of giving his full attention to whoever was speaking to him, so completely that it sometimes felt like being held. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Celeste Vane's letter, is it possible to get a copy of it?" "I don't see how," Dorothy said. "Mabel has it." "I might be able to request one," he said. "If it makes specific claims that are provably false, there could be grounds for action." Dorothy shook her head. "Even if it is provably false, the proving takes time, and Mabel's version is already what people believe. A correction never travels as far as the original story." He looked at her with an expression that acknowledged she was right and did not insult her by pretending otherwise. "Then we need to change the story," he said. "We," Dorothy said. He picked up his hat from the table. "I know I walked into your back door unannounced," he said. "If you'd prefer I not involve myself, I'll respect that." She looked at him, tall, serious, with silver at his temples and honest eyes. A man who had walked into a general store and stopped a room with nothing more than a look, because he had seen something unjust happening and had decided without apparent internal debate that it needed stopping. "How would you propose to change the story?" she asked. He thought about it for a moment, and she liked that he took the question seriously rather than producing a ready answer. "By giving the town something better to talk about," he said. "By making sure that the people who matter see that you have the support of the law, which in a town like this carries a certain weight, and by being visible." "Visible," she repeated. "Yes. If I'm seen to believe in your good character publicly, it gives people permission to draw their own conclusions rather than accepting Mabel's version." He paused. "It's not a perfect solution." "No," Dorothy agreed, "but it's something." He stood to leave and then stopped. "May I come back?" he asked. "Tomorrow afternoon, perhaps. If you're agreeable, I thought we might take a walk along the main street, publicly." Dorothy Morgan looked at Sheriff Ezekiel Chandler in her kitchen, with the afternoon light coming through the window, and she made a calculation that was partly practical and partly something else entirely, something she would not name to herself for quite some time yet. "I'll have coffee ready at 3, she said. He nodded, put his hat on, and let himself out the back door, and Dorothy stood at the kitchen window watching him walk away through her kitchen garden, and thought that she had not felt less alone than this in a very long time. The next afternoon, he came at 3. She had the coffee ready and also a slice of the apple pie she had made that morning, because she always baked when she was anxious, and she had been very anxious indeed. They drank the coffee and she gave him the pie, and he ate it with the serious attention he seemed to give everything, and he said it was the best pie he had eaten in Kansas, which she did not entirely believe but which she accepted because it was kindly meant. Then they went for a walk. They walked the full length of Main Street in the September afternoon sunshine, and Ezekiel Chandler tipped his hat to everyone they passed, and Dorothy held her chin at the angle she had perfected and met every eye that was offered to her. And by the time they turned around at the far end of the street near the livery stable and started back, Dorothy had counted 7 people who had nodded to her, 3 who had actively spoken, and 1, old Mr. Kavanaugh, who had taken her hand and said, "Good afternoon, Miss Dorothy. How are the pies coming along?" As though there were nothing in the world to remark upon. One who had turned away. Only one. It was a small thing. But small things in a town like Millfield, in a situation like Dorothy's, were everything. They walked back through the late afternoon, and Dorothy felt something she had not felt in years, something she had nearly forgotten the texture of, the specific sensation of not being entirely alone in the world, of having someone beside her who had chosen to be there. Over the following weeks, Ezekiel Chandler became a fixture at her back door, not every day but regularly enough that Mrs. Hendricks next door had clearly noticed and had clearly decided, in that particular way of neighbors who have concluded that something is happening, to say nothing about it while very visibly looking the other way whenever Ezekiel's horse was tied at Dorothy's fence. He helped her. He did it quietly and without fanfare, in the way of a man who has no interest in credit. He spoke of her in the way you speak of someone you trust when trust is mentioned in conversation. He ate her midday meals when he was in the vicinity of the tea room, and paid for them with scrupulous fairness, and recommended them to other people. He found out, through channels he did not entirely explain, the identity of a second correspondent in St. Louis who had known Dorothy during her years there, and who was willing to write a letter of character that was warm and specific and entirely credible, and he helped Dorothy understand how to put this letter into circulation in the town without it appearing to be a campaign. He also, gradually, began to tell her things. He had not, she quickly understood, had an easy life. He had been born in San Angelo, Texas, the son of a man who worked cattle and a mother who taught herself to read from the Bible and then taught her children the same way. He had 3 younger brothers, all still in Texas, 2 of whom had families. He had spent his early 20s as a cattle hand and then a deputy in New Mexico, where he had learned that the law, even when it was imperfect, was better than the alternative, and that the kind of man who wore a badge was the kind of man he wanted to be, even when it was hard. He had been, briefly, engaged to a woman in Albuquerque whose name was Maria, and who had decided, not without reason, that she did not want to spend her life waiting for a lawman to come home. He mentioned this once, matter-of-factly, without apparent bitterness, and Dorothy received it with equal composure and thought about it for a long time afterward. He was 34. She was 31. There was a 3-year difference in age that felt like nothing at all, and an entire landscape of different experiences that felt, somehow, like they had arrived at similar conclusions by different roads. She noticed things about him. She noticed that he always removed his hat when he came into her kitchen, and that he always put it on the same corner of the table, and that when he was thinking carefully, he pressed his lips together in a way that made the lines at the corners of his eyes deepen. She noticed that he read, which was less common than one might hope in a frontier sheriff, and that he had opinions about what he read that were interesting and sometimes surprising. She noticed that he was careful with other people's feelings without being sentimental about them, which was a combination she had not encountered often. She noticed that when he looked at her, he looked at all of her, not just the surface of her, the respectable widow running her tea room, but something underneath that, something she was not sure she had let anyone see in a very long time. One evening in late September, she had closed the tea room and was sitting on her small back porch in the cooling air, reading a novel she had borrowed from the town's lending library, when she heard the gate in the garden fence open and looked up to see Ezekiel walking across the dark garden with a lantern. "I saw your light on," he said, which was not entirely an explanation for why he had come, but she did not require one. "Sit down," she said, and he sat in the other chair she kept on the porch, and they sat together in the September dark, and he told her about a telegram he had received that day from his brother in Texas, who had a new baby, another boy, making 3 sons in 4 years, and Ezekiel said this with a smile that was genuine and warm and also underneath it faintly lonely, the way the happiness of people you love can sometimes be when you are watching it from a distance. "Do you miss Texas?" Dorothy asked. "Sometimes," he said. "I miss my family. Texas itself I can take or leave." He paused. "Do you miss Missouri?" Dorothy considered this seriously. "I miss who I thought I was going to be there," she said, "when I was young and the future was still just a story I was telling myself." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What was the story?" She looked at the garden in the lantern light. "Oh, the ordinary one," she said. "A house and a family and someone to grow old with. I thought it was going to be simpler than it turned out to be." "It usually is," he said, and there was something in his voice that she felt rather than heard, a resonance that pressed against something in her chest. They sat in the quiet and the dark, and the lantern burned between them, and Dorothy thought that if she had been asked 3 months ago whether she would spend a September evening sitting on her porch with the town sheriff feeling something she would have described, if she were being honest with herself, as completely and unexpectedly content, she would have said that was entirely impossible. She would have been wrong. The situation with Mabel Pritchard had not resolved itself. That would have been too simple, and Mabel Pritchard was not a simple woman. What had happened was more nuanced than resolution. The story Mabel had tried to establish had lost a good deal of its traction, partly because of Ezekiel's visible and consistent support of Dorothy, partly because the letter from St. Louis had done its quiet work, and partly because Millfield was a town of practical people who, when the initial drama had settled, had returned to caring primarily about whether Dorothy's bread was good and her prices were fair. Both of these things were true, so most of them had come back. But Mabel had not forgiven Dorothy for not being ruined. Dorothy could feel this the way you feel a storm that has not yet broken, a pressure in the air, a quality of waiting. She had seen Mabel twice since the general store incident, once at church and once at the post office, and both times Mabel had looked at her with a smooth and expressionless face that told Dorothy nothing except that the game was not over. In October, she found out what the next move was. She was at the post office collecting her mail when she overheard, through the thin wall that divided the collection room from the postmaster's office, a conversation between Mabel Pritchard and the postmaster, Harold Graves, who was Mabel's cousin and whose loyalty was therefore not in question. The conversation was about Dorothy's lease. The house on Willow Street, the house she had converted into the tea room, was owned by Agnes Langley, who was old and whose arthritis was worsening. Harold Graves was apparently in the process of explaining to Mabel that Agnes's nephew had recently arrived in Millfield, with some intention of reviewing Agnes's various business arrangements on his aunt's behalf. The nephew, a man named Frederick Langley, was apparently disposed to be reasonable about existing leases, but only if there were no concerns raised about the character of the tenants. Dorothy stood very still on the other side of the thin wall. This, she understood, was the hidden motive. Mabel did not simply want to embarrass her. Mabel wanted her gone, wanted her out of the tea room and out of the house and out of Millfield entirely. And she was going to use the gossip she had already planted as the tool with which to lever Dorothy's lease away from her. She walked home very quickly, sat down at her table, and thought carefully about what she was dealing with. Mabel Pritchard had a hidden motive. The public humiliation had been a trap, designed not just to wound her reputation, but to create conditions for a larger, more final attack. The question was not whether Dorothy could weather the gossip. She was already weathering it. The question was whether she could protect her lease. She needed to talk to Agnes Langley. And she needed to talk to Ezekiel. She went to Agnes first, because Agnes was her landlady and the relationship was more clearly defined. Agnes received her in the front parlor with the lavender water smell and the sharp eyes that arthritis had not dimmed at all. "I know why you're here," Agnes said, before Dorothy could begin. "Frederick told me about the lease review, and Mabel Pritchard told Frederick something about you that I have already told Frederick is a piece of malicious nonsense." Dorothy let out a breath she had not known she was holding. "My nephew," Agnes continued, "is an obedient boy in many respects, but he is not, thank God, an idiot, and he has lived long enough to know what Mabel Pritchard's benevolent concern for other people's business arrangements actually means. I've told him that your lease is sound, your character is impeccable, and that if he ever takes legal advice from a banker's wife again, I will revise my will in a direction he won't enjoy." Dorothy felt something in her chest that was partly relief and partly something that might have been tears if she had been the sort of person who cried in other people's parlors, which she was not. "Thank you, Agnes," she said. "Don't thank me," Agnes said briskly. "Keep the bread orders coming. That's all the thanks I require." She went to Ezekiel that evening. She found him at the jailhouse going over some papers, and she told him what she had overheard through the post office wall and what Agnes had said, and he listened with his full and careful attention, and when she was finished he was quiet for a moment. "She's not going to stop," he said. "Mabel, she's invested too much in this now. If you stay and thrive, it's a defeat for her and she won't accept that." "I know," Dorothy said. "Then the question is how to make it more costly for her to continue than to stop," he said. He leaned back in his chair and pressed his lips together in the way she had come to recognize, and the lines at the corners of his eyes deepened. "How certain are you about what you overheard through that wall?" "Very certain," Dorothy said. "I have quite good hearing." "Would you be willing to swear to it?" She looked at him steadily. "What would that mean?" "It would mean," he said carefully, "that there may be grounds for what is called tortious interference. The deliberate interference in a valid business relationship for malicious purposes. It's a civil matter rather than a criminal one, so my involvement would be limited. But if you were willing to consult with a lawyer, it might be worth exploring." Dorothy thought about the cost of a lawyer versus the cost of losing her livelihood. It was not a difficult calculation. "Who is the lawyer in Millfield?" she asked. "James Alcott," Ezekiel said. "He's good. And he doesn't like Garrett Pritchard, which in this situation may be useful." Dorothy almost smiled. "Why doesn't he like Garrett Pritchard?" "Garrett foreclosed on Alcott's brother-in-law's farm in 1879, Ezekiel said. "Some disagreements are permanent." Dorothy laughed. It surprised her, the way the laugh came up suddenly, and she clapped a hand over her mouth, and Ezekiel looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not surprise exactly, but something that was warm and suddenly unguarded, and she was struck by how much younger it made him look, and how, in that moment, she wanted very much to see that expression again. She met with James Alcott 2 days later. He was a thin man with spectacles and an air of precise intelligence, and he listened to her account with his fingertips pressed together and his eyebrows very slightly elevated. "Miss Morgan," he said when she finished. You understand that civil litigation in this county, even with strong evidence, is slow and expensive. I understand, Dorothy said. What you overheard may well constitute evidence of intentional interference, he said. However, I want to propose something that might achieve the same result more quickly. Rather than filing a suit which Mabel Pritchard would resist through every possible procedural delay and which could take years, we send a letter. A letter, Dorothy said. A very specific letter, Alcott said, to Garrett Pritchard personally, not to Mabel, outlining the legal basis for a tortious interference claim in precise and credible language, and making clear that Miss Dorothy Morgan has legal representation and is prepared to pursue this to its conclusion. Garrett Pritchard is a banker. Bankers do not enjoy lawsuits. Garrett Pritchard controls his wife's access to social influence through his social standing and his money. If we make him understand that Mabel's campaign could cost him a legal battle and a considerable amount of public scrutiny about his own business practices, he may find it convenient to end her campaign on her behalf. Dorothy sat with this. You're saying we use Mabel against herself, she said, force Garrett to choose between his wife's grudge and his own reputation. Alcott looked at her over his spectacles. Miss Morgan, he said, you clearly have a very efficient mind. Will it work, she asked. I give it a 70% chance, Alcott said. I have found that bankers respond well to the word litigation. Write the letter, Dorothy said. Alcott wrote the letter. It went to Garrett Pritchard on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Mabel Pritchard had canceled her subscription to the Women's Church Society for the winter session, citing unspecified personal obligations, and had spent considerable time being visibly absorbed in domestic matters that kept her from the public spaces of Millfield. It was not a complete victory. It was a strategic withdrawal. Dorothy understood the difference and accepted it for what it was, because what it was enough. The following Sunday she sat in church, and Mabel Pritchard sat 3 rows ahead and did not look at her once. And Dorothy sang the hymns with a voice that was clear and steady. And afterward Pastor Holt shook her hand and said she had been missed at the Harvest Committee meeting, and Dorothy said she would make time to attend the next one. She walked home alone in the October sunshine, and the dust of Main Street was gold in the light, and the elms that lined Willow Street were turning amber and red, and Dorothy Morgan felt, cautiously, the first thin thread of something that might one day become hope. Ezekiel was waiting at her gate. She stopped when she saw him, not from surprise exactly, because she had begun to half expect him in the way you begin to expect good weather after several fine days, but from the particular sensation she always experienced now when she saw him unexpectedly, a sudden sharpening of attention that she still was not quite naming to herself. How was the service? He asked. Peaceful, she said, which told him everything. He opened the gate for her, which he did naturally, without making a gesture of it, and she walked through, and they went around to the back garden where the afternoon light was warm, and the late-season kitchen garden was mostly finished, but still had the dry stalks of tomatoes and the last of the pole beans clinging to their frames. He sat on the porch step, and she sat in her chair, and they were quiet together for a while in the way that had become comfortable and necessary to her, in a way she had not anticipated and had not prepared for and was not entirely sure what to do with. Dorothy, he said. He rarely used her given name without the miss in front of it, and the sound of it without the formality landed differently, settled somewhere in her chest with a weight that was not unpleasant. She looked at him. He had his hat in his hands again, turning it in that way he had, slowly, around and around. I need to say something to you, he said, and I want to say it correctly, so if I take a moment, please bear with me. She waited. She had learned that rushing Ezekiel Chandler was as productive as rushing a river. When I walked into that general store 6 weeks ago, he said, and I saw what was happening to you, I didn't stop the room for any professional reason. I want you to understand that. I stopped it because I could not stand to watch you be treated that way. He paused. And in the time since then, I've come to value our conversations and your company more than I know how to say without sounding like something I'm not, which is a man who speaks easily about things like this." Dorothy's hands were still in her lap. She was very still. "What I'm trying to say," Ezekiel continued, "is that what I feel for you is not the kind of thing a sheriff feels for a townsperson he's trying to help. It's the other kind of thing. And I need to know if that is unwelcome, because if it is, I will manage it quietly and we can continue as we have been, and that would still be worth more to me than anything else in my life right now." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. At the serious dark eyes and the silver temples and the hat turning in his hands, and the particular quality he had of being entirely, honestly himself, of having no hidden motive that she had ever discovered and having had many opportunities to look for one. "Ezekiel," she said, and he looked at her. "When you walked into that general store, do you know what I thought when I saw you?" "No," he said. "I thought, here is a man who is going to do the right thing," she said. "Because that is what you looked like, and you did it. You did exactly that. And afterward, every time you have come through that gate or sat at my kitchen table or walked next to me down Main Street, the thought I keep having is the same one. Here is a man who does the right thing, and I cannot tell you how rare that is or how much it means to me." He was watching her with absolute attention. "I am not frightened of what you're feeling," she said. "I am frightened of my own feelings, which have been considerable and which I have not known what to do with. And I am frightened because the last time I gave someone my trust, which is a thing I do not do easily, it turned out that the world was more complicated than I had understood, and that complication nearly undid me." "I know," he said quietly. "But I think," she said, and her voice was careful and deliberate, "that I would very much like to try, if you are patient with me." "I am the most patient man in Kansas," Ezekiel Chandler said, with such absolute sincerity that Dorothy laughed again, the same sudden laugh that surprised her, and he smiled, that unguarded expression she had seen once before, and she thought she would like to spend a good deal of time making that expression appear on his face. They did not rush. She was grateful for that, because rushing would have frightened her in ways she could not have easily explained. They moved instead at the pace of the frontier seasons, which was sometimes faster than the calendar suggested and sometimes much slower. He came to her back door and they had coffee. They walked Main Street on Sunday afternoons when the week's work was done. They sat on her porch in the evenings as October became November and the nights turned cold, and he brought an extra blanket from his house one evening without comment, and she used it without comment, and neither of them mentioned it for several days, at which point it simply became the porch blanket, which he had brought, and which was there when he came, and this felt like an arrangement of perfect sufficiency. He held her hand for the first time on a November afternoon when they were walking along the dry creek bed south of town. It was not planned, or if it was, neither of them had announced a plan. His hand simply found hers, large and warm and careful, and her fingers curved around his, and they walked along the creek bed together for another half-mile before turning back toward town, and neither of them said anything about it at all. He kissed her on her front porch on a Thursday evening, when the first snow of the year was falling in thick soft flakes that made the street lights of Millfield look like something from a painting. She had just said good night and turned toward the door, and he said her name, and when she turned back he stepped forward and kissed her gently and carefully, with the same seriousness he brought to everything, and she held very still for a moment and then put her hand against his chest and kissed him back. When they separated, he looked at her in the falling snow with that expression she had been cataloging, and she said, "Good night, Ezekiel." "Good night, Dorothy," he said, and walked down the steps, and she went inside and stood in her hallway for a full minute with her eyes closed, and her hand pressed against her sternum where something had taken up residence that she could not remember inviting in and could not imagine now evicting. November became December. Millfield decorated for Christmas with the particular intensity of a small Kansas town that has had a hard year and has decided that the holidays require making up for it. The main street went up with pine boughs and colored ribbon, and Agnes Langley organized the church choir for the Christmas concert and asked Dorothy to contribute 24 pies to the church social on Christmas Eve, which Dorothy accepted as the fullest possible measure of social rehabilitation. On the 15th of December, Ezekiel came to the tea room for the midday meal and sat in his usual seat near the window and waited until the other patrons had cleared out before he said, "I have a question that I've been working up to for several weeks." Dorothy sat down across from him, which she had started doing when the room was empty, and which she could tell he liked because of the way he settled when she did it, something in his shoulders losing the faint set of vigilance he always carried outside. "Ask it," she said. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I would like very much for you to marry me," he said. "I am aware that I'm asking this after a relatively short acquaintance, and that you have very good reasons to be careful with your trust and your future. I'm not asking for an answer right now. I'm asking you to consider it." Dorothy looked at him across the table. The winter light through the tea room windows was thin and silver, and the coal stove in the corner was making its comfortable ticking sound, and the room smelled of coffee and cinnamon, and the good ordinary smell of a place she had built with her own hands. "Ezekiel," she said, "have you considered that you are asking a woman who has been widowed and nearly financially ruined and publicly slandered, all within the last 2 years, to consider a decision of lifelong commitment?" "Yes," he said. "I have considered that extensively. It is part of why I've been working up to it for several weeks." She looked at him for a long moment. At the serious face and the honest eyes and the man who had come through her back gate in September with his hat in his hands because he had wanted to do the right thing. "Ask me again in spring," she said. "Give me until spring. Not because I need more time to know my own mind, but because I want to make sure that I am choosing the future and not running from the past." He nodded without apparent disappointment, with the patience that was, she had come to believe, genuinely the most extraordinary thing about him. "Spring," he said. Christmas passed, and the new year of 1883 came in with a week of hard cold that froze the well pump, and sent everyone in Millfield indoors for an extended period of communal impatience. Dorothy kept the tea room warm and made hearty soups and the kind of thick corn bread that the weather demanded, and Ezekiel found occasions to come in that had less to do with hunger than with the habit of being where she was. One February afternoon, she was in the back of the kitchen working on supply orders when she heard raised voices from the main room. She came through to find Mabel Pritchard. Mabel had not been inside the tea room since the previous summer. She stood in the center of the room in her good winter coat with her chin elevated to the position it always occupied in the presence of people she was managing, and Dorothy stood in the doorway to the kitchen and they looked at each other. "Mrs. Pritchard," Dorothy said, "can I help you?" There was a moment of evaluation, and then something on Mabel's face shifted very slightly, not softened. Mabel Pritchard did not soften, but something recalibrated. "I would like a cup of tea," Mabel said. "If you can manage it without making a production of the occasion." Dorothy looked at her for a moment. Then she went and made the tea. She brought it to the table where Mabel had seated herself. She sat across from her because standing felt like a performance she was not interested in giving. Mabel wrapped her gloved hands around the cup and looked at it. "I understand," Mabel said, "that you have employed a lawyer." "I have," Dorothy said. "Garrett found the letter somewhat irritating," Mabel said. "I expect he did," Dorothy said. Mabel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the precision of a woman choosing words from a very limited selection, "I may have proceeded on the basis of information that was less reliable than I understood it to be." Dorothy waited. "Celeste Vane," Mabel said, "is not a straightforward correspondent." "No," Dorothy agreed, "she is not." Another silence. The tea steam rose between them. "I don't apologize easily," Mabel said. "I know," Dorothy said. Mabel looked at her across the table with those sharp, assessing eyes that had been turned on Dorothy like a weapon for months, and for the first time they were turned on her with something approaching ordinary human assessment rather than strategy. "You are a more capable woman than I gave you credit for," Mabel said. "Thank you," Dorothy said, and meant it. "If you were interested in joining the spring planning committee for the Independence Day celebration," Mabel said, with the air of someone making a business proposition rather than a social one, "your contribution of pies and bread has historically been valuable, and the committee would benefit from your domestic expertise." Dorothy looked at her for a long moment. She understood what this was. It was not friendship. It was not warmth. It was a negotiated ceasefire expressed in the language of small-town committee memberships, which was the only diplomatic vocabulary Millfield offered. And it was, in its way, as close to a public retraction as Mabel Pritchard would ever produce. "I'll be at the first meeting," Dorothy said. Mabel stood, set a coin on the table for the tea, and left without looking back. Dorothy sat for a moment and then went to the window and watched Mabel's straight-backed figure move down the street, and thought that people were complicated, and that complicated was not always the same as bad. She told Ezekiel that evening. He listened, and then he said, with a brief and genuine amusement that she loved, "Mabel Pritchard came to make peace over a cup of your tea. Apparently your reputation for even-handedness has made certain people reconsider the wisdom of being your enemy," he said. "And the lawyer's letter was, I think, the last piece. Garrett Pritchard would rather endorse your character publicly than face discovery in court." "So everyone has their reasons," Dorothy said. "They always do," Ezekiel agreed. The winter moved slowly and then faster, the way winters do when you have things to look forward to, and by March the first green was showing on the hillside south of town, and the creeks were running clear with snowmelt, and the quality of light was changing from the flat white of winter to something warmer and more present. Dorothy walked out to the dry creek bed one March afternoon, the same one where Ezekiel had first taken her hand, and she stood on the bank in the cold spring sunshine and had a long conversation with herself that covered the ground she had been covering all winter: what she wanted, what she feared, what was true, and what was simply the residue of old pain dressed up as caution. She had her answer by the time she got home. She went to the jailhouse. Ezekiel was at his desk, the same papers or different ones, the duties of a frontier sheriff in 1883, producing a steady supply of administrative work that he addressed with the same steady thoroughness he brought to everything. He looked up when she came in. "You said to ask you again in spring," he said. "Yes," Dorothy said. "I walked out to the creek this afternoon, and—" She stood in the doorway of the jailhouse and looked at the man behind the desk, the serious face and the honest eyes and the silver at his temples and the badge on his chest. And she thought of the general store in August, and the back gate in September, and the porch in the snow in November, and the countless cups of coffee and the hand holding hers along the creek bed, and all the things that had accumulated between them like stones laid for a path, steady and deliberate and heading somewhere. "Yes," she said. He was still for a moment in the way he sometimes was, that quality of deep internal attention. Then he stood up and came around the desk, and he took her face in his hands, large, careful hands, the way he always touched her, as though she were something worth being careful with. And he looked at her for a long moment and then kissed her, and she put her arms around him and held on, and the afternoon sun through the jailhouse window was warm on her back, and outside on Main Street the ordinary sounds of Millfield went on. Horses and voices, and the distant hammer of the new building going up on 2nd Street, the sounds of a frontier town in spring, full of possibility and effort, and the particular noise of people building their lives in an unfinished place. They were married in May. The wedding was held in the church where Dorothy had sat through the previous October with Mabel Pritchard 3 rows ahead and sung the hymns with her chin up. Pastor Holt presided. Agnes Langley sat in the front row and cried without apparent self-consciousness, which Dorothy found deeply moving. Clara Briggs, who had redeemed herself thoroughly in the months following the general store incident by showing up at Dorothy's door with a jar of preserves, and an apology that was long enough to be genuine, served as witness alongside Ezekiel's deputy, a young man named Robert Crane, who was so nervous that he almost dropped the rings. Mabel Pritchard attended with Garrett and sat 3 rows back, and when the pastor asked if anyone had objections and the church was very quiet, Dorothy looked straight ahead and felt nothing from that direction, except the particular vibrating absence of someone choosing not to speak. Ezekiel said his vows in a voice that was steady and certain, and quiet enough that the people in the back pews had to lean forward, and Dorothy said hers in a voice that she had to work, briefly, to keep from shaking, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of the moment, the understanding that she was standing in a place she had not known she would stand again after Thomas died, and the life she had planned dissolved around her. Afterward, there was a dinner in the church hall that Dorothy had organized, naturally, since organizing food events was her particular genius, and there was dancing, a fiddle player Ezekiel had found in the neighboring town of Cordell, and people danced until well past 9, which was late for Millfield on a weeknight. Agnes Langley, 3 glasses of the good imported wine into the evening, told Dorothy that she was the most competent tenant she had ever had, and also, lowering her voice to a register she clearly thought was confidential, but which could be heard by at least 6 people nearby, the finest example of a woman making her own way in a difficult world. Dorothy kissed Agnes Langley's papery cheek and meant every bit of it. Ezekiel moved into the house on Willow Street, which was enough space for 2, and which they both understood would require expansion sooner or later if the conversation they had been having carefully and honestly about the future continued to develop. The jailhouse remained his working space. Dorothy kept the tea room. The arrangement was practical, and it was something more than practical. It was 2 people who had built their own lives before they knew each other, and who now understood how to share one without either dissolving into the other. The summer of 1883 was a good one. The rains came at the right time, and the crops in the county came in well, and the general mood of Millfield was buoyant in the way that agricultural communities can be when the weather cooperates. Dorothy's tea room flourished. She hired a girl to help in the kitchen 3 days a week, a quiet, capable young woman named Emma, 15 years old, the daughter of one of the homesteading families south of town, and Emma turned out to have a natural instinct for baking that Dorothy recognized and began quietly to develop. She was teaching, she realized. She was teaching the way her father had taught, not standing in front of a blackboard but working alongside someone and letting the knowledge transfer through the practice rather than the lecture. She found she liked it enormously. Ezekiel noticed. He noticed everything, which was the quality that made him a good sheriff and also the quality that made him very much worth being married to. And one evening in August, a year almost exactly from the day Dorothy had walked into the general store and felt her world beginning to come apart, he sat across from her at the kitchen table and said, "You're a good teacher." "I might be," she agreed. "Have you thought," he said, "about the schoolhouse?" Looked at him. "What about it?" "Miss Hartwell is leaving at the end of September," he said. "She's going east to be married. The school board has been talking about finding a replacement. I mentioned your name." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You mentioned my name to the school board." "I mentioned it as a possibility," he said carefully, "because I thought you ought to know about the opening, not because I was making decisions for you. What you do with the information is entirely your own business." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the August evening light, at the serious face that was no longer quite so serious when they were alone together, at the eyes that she could now read with a fluency she had not had even 6 months ago, and at the man she had come to know so thoroughly and trust so completely that the trust had stopped feeling like an act of courage and had simply become the air of the room. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it for a week. She visited the schoolhouse, a single large room with 4 long windows and a stove in the corner and rows of worn desks, and she stood in the middle of it and felt the weight of the room. the accumulated weight of years of children sitting in those seats, and the potential weight of years to come. She thought about what she could teach, and how she could teach it, and what it would mean to do it here, in this particular place, which had tried to reject her and had failed, and which she had claimed by simply refusing to be moved. She spoke to the school board chairman, a serious man named Porter, who was also, she had learned, the man who had hired James Alcott as town attorney 3 years ago, which told her something about his judgment. She accepted the position in September, with the agreement that she would maintain the tea room's Saturday operations and lease the weekday operation to Emma, who was now 16 and whose confidence in the kitchen had grown alongside her skills. She stood in front of her first class on the first Monday of October 1883, 22 children between the ages of 6 and 14, sitting in the worn desks with their slates and their lunch pails, and she said, "Good morning. My name is Mrs. Chandler. We are going to have an excellent year." 22 pairs of eyes looked at her. A few of them were skeptical, which she appreciated. The ones who were skeptical were often the ones who were paying attention. The year that followed was the fullest of Dorothy's life. She taught arithmetic and reading, and the basics of American history and geography with the same organizational competence she had brought to the tea room. And she discovered that children responded to her in ways that gratified her deeply, not because she was easy on them, but because she was fair, which was the thing that children, like adults, always recognized and always valued. Ezekiel came to the schoolhouse for the winter reading exhibition and sat in the back row next to Robert Crane, the deputy, and watched the children recite their pieces. And afterward he told her that watching her work was something he could recommend unreservedly. She kissed him in the schoolhouse doorway, which was slightly improper, and which she did not regret at all. In the spring of 1884, Dorothy discovered she was expecting a child. She told Ezekiel on a Sunday evening in March, sitting at the kitchen table, because the kitchen table had become the place where the important things were said between them, the place where they had been honest with each other from the very beginning. He was very still for a moment, the way he sometimes was when something landed on him with weight. Then he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something that was larger and more vulnerable than his usual careful gravity, something that was entirely and completely joy. He reached across the table and took her hand. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Surprised," she said, "and frightened, and very glad." "All of those are reasonable," he said. "I know that with a child coming we'll need more space," she said. "The house on Willow Street is adequate now, but it won't be. I've been looking at the Harmon property on the edge of town," he said. "The one with the big kitchen and the rooms in the back." She stared at him. "You've been looking at properties." "Not with any definite intention," he said, with the particular quality he had of being truthful about his thoughts even when the thoughts were slightly revealing. "I have been looking at it since January, when I found myself thinking about the future in certain ways." Dorothy looked at this man across her kitchen table, this man who had walked into a general store and stopped a room with a look, and then walked through her back gate with his hat in his hands, and felt a fullness in her chest that she was not sure language had adequate equipment to describe. "Show me the Harmon property," she said. He showed her the Harmon property that week. It was a house of generous proportions on the eastern edge of town, with a large kitchen and a proper parlor, and 3 rooms on the upper floor, and a wide front porch, and a kitchen garden that had been let go somewhat, but that Dorothy stood in, and looked at with the particular eye of a woman who sees not what is there but what could be. She turned around in the kitchen garden with the March wind in her hair, and looked at Ezekiel standing at the garden gate watching her evaluate the property. And she said, "We need to fix the porch railing and completely rework the garden, and I want a proper root cellar." "All of that can be arranged," he said. They bought the Harmon property in April with a combination of the money Dorothy had saved from the tea room and the small amount Ezekiel had accumulated over his years of steady, uncelebrated, honest work, and they spent the summer making it into a home, which was different from making it into a house. The first difference she noticed was space. There was space for Ezekiel's books, which had previously occupied 3 stacks in the corner of the Willow Street kitchen, in a configuration that she had long suspected was geologically unstable. There was space for the large kitchen table she had always wanted and a proper larder, and the root cellar that was installed in July by a man named Asa Porter, the school board chairman's younger brother, who knew root cellars with the same specificity that other men knew horses. The second difference was the porch. The Harmon house porch ran the full width of the front of the house and faced west, which meant that in the evenings, when the work was done and the supper cleared away, you could sit in the porch chairs and watch the Kansas sky do what Kansas skies did in summer, turn through stages of gold and orange and deep rose into the deep blue of true evening, in a display that never became ordinary no matter how many times you saw it. They sat on that porch through the evenings of Dorothy's pregnancy, watching the sky change, and they talked about everything and nothing, about the children she taught and the cases he managed, and the books they were reading and the town's ongoing dramas, which were milder now that Mabel Pritchard had refocused her organizational energies on the Independence Day Committee where they were genuinely useful, and about the baby that was coming and what that would mean and what they hoped for. In October, 2 years almost exactly from the day Dorothy had accepted Ezekiel's coffee in the jailhouse doorway and said yes to the future, their son was born. They named him Samuel. Samuel James Chandler, the James for Dorothy's father, who was the man who had taught her that knowledge was the only property that could not be taken from you, and who had died 6 years ago with that lesson still fully intact. Samuel arrived into the world with the full-throated opinion of a healthy infant and the dark hair of his father, and absolutely nothing apologetic about his presence whatsoever. And Dorothy lay in the large bedroom of the Harmon house in the October dark, and held her son, and looked at Ezekiel sitting in the chair beside the bed, with an expression of such complete and bewildered wonder that she would have laughed if she had not been so thoroughly exhausted. "He's so small," Ezekiel said, which was something every father said about every newborn and was always sincere. "He won't be for long," Dorothy said, which was also something every mother said and was equally sincere. Agnes Langley came to see Samuel the following morning and held him with the careful expertise of a woman who had held many infants, and said he was a very fine boy, and that she was glad Dorothy had come to Millfield, regardless of the circumstances. Clara Briggs brought a quilt she had made herself, in blues and greens, the colors of water, which she said had seemed like the right choice without being able to explain why, and Dorothy accepted it and hung it on the wall of the baby's room where it caught the morning light. Samuel grew with the unhurried efficiency of a healthy child in good conditions, and Dorothy returned to the schoolhouse in January because she had given her word, and because the 22 children in those worn desks were hers in a way she had not anticipated and could not simply hand off. She brought Samuel to the schoolhouse on the mornings when Emma, who now ran the tea room on Tuesday and Thursday, and Saturday with a steadiness that put Dorothy entirely at ease, could not take him. The children adored Samuel with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of children for babies, and the oldest girls competed quietly for the honor of minding him during the midday break, which freed Dorothy to eat her lunch without interruption, which she considered a professional benefit. The year moved through its seasons. Millfield grew. A second general store opened on 2nd Street, which generated the particular species of civic excitement that competition produces in small towns. The railroad expanded its schedule through the county, which brought new settlers and new commerce, and a general expansion of possibility that the town received with the slightly nervous excitement of a place that has been small long enough to have mixed feelings about growing. Ezekiel's territory expanded with the county. He hired a second deputy, a quiet, steady man named Daniel who had come up from New Mexico and who reminded Dorothy slightly of what Ezekiel must have been like at 26, careful and watchful and deeply serious about the work. They discussed whether Ezekiel should consider the appointed position of county marshal, which was being created to handle the expanded territory. It was a longer conversation, several evenings on the porch with the sky changing above them, because it was a real question and they were people who took real questions seriously. It would mean more travel, Ezekiel said, more time away from home. I know, Dorothy said, but it would also mean more influence. The ability to do the thing you do, which is the right thing, over a larger area. He looked at her sidelong. I'm not pushing you toward it, she said. I'm telling you that if it's what you want, the practical objections are not insurmountable. Samuel, he said. Samuel has 2 parents and is a resilient child, Dorothy said. And I am a woman who has managed a good deal of complexity in my life. A husband who travels occasionally is well within my capabilities. He accepted the marshal position in the spring of 1886, and the additional territory and the additional responsibility suited him in the way that larger containers suit people who have always been slightly too big for the space they occupied, not with arrogance, but with the natural ease of someone who has found their proper scale. Dorothy, teaching and managing the household and overseeing Emma's continuing development of the tea room, which had now hired 2 additional girls and had extended its hours to include Thursday evening suppers by reservation, found that she was busier than she had ever been and more satisfied than she had ever thought she would be. Samuel learned to walk in the kitchen of the Harmon house, lurching from the table leg to his father's knee, with the triumphant determination of a boy who had clearly decided that this particular skill was entirely achievable, and that the floor was simply an obstacle to be managed. In the fall of 1886, when Samuel was almost 2, Dorothy discovered she was expecting again. This one she told Ezekiel not at the kitchen table but on the porch in the evening, watching the Kansas sky go through its progressions. He took her hand the same way he had taken it the first time, carefully and completely, and asked the same question. How are you feeling? Experienced, she said, which made him laugh, a real laugh, the kind that made the lines at the corners of his eyes deepen in the way she had been cataloging since the first autumn. The second child was a daughter. They named her Eleanor Agnes, the Agnes for Agnes Langley, who received this information with a ferocity of emotion that she attempted to conceal behind brisk commentary about the current state of her arthritis, and failed completely to hide, and whose eyes were bright and fierce when she held the baby for the first time. Dorothy stood in the doorway of the parlor watching Agnes hold Eleanor and felt the particular fullness of a woman surveying what her life has become, not in the way of counting blessings, which always felt slightly performative to her, but in the simpler way of recognition. This is real. This is mine. I built this. Samuel, at 2.5, regarded his sister with the cautious suspicion of a child confronted with a new development he has not been consulted about, but within 3 weeks had adopted a proprietary pride in her that expressed itself as telling everyone who came to the house to be quiet because Eleanor was sleeping, delivered with the authority of a very small person who has recently discovered authority. Ezekiel and Dorothy lay in the bedroom of the Harmon house on an autumn night while the Kansas wind moved through the tall grass outside the window and both children slept, and Dorothy said quietly into the dark, "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" "Tell me," he said. "I think about walking into that general store," she said, "with Mabel Pritchard and the letter and everyone looking at me, and I think, if it had not happened the way it did, if she had not tried to ruin me and you had not come in at exactly that moment, would we be here?" He was quiet for a moment, and she felt him thinking, the particular quality of his attention even in the dark. "I'd been looking for an excuse to come to your back door since May," he said. She turned her head toward him in the dark. "May, we met in August." "I know when we met," he said. "I saw you in April at the general store buying supplies and then again in May at the church social." I thought about introducing myself. I thought about it several times. I was, at that point in my life, not quick about these things." Dorothy was silent for a moment. "So Mabel Pritchard's scheme to ruin me," she said carefully, "may have inadvertently provided you with a reason to stop thinking about it." "It would be overstating it to say she did us a favor," Ezekiel said, in the tone of a man choosing his words with great care. "But the timing was what it was." Dorothy laughed in the dark, quietly so as not to wake the children, and he pulled her closer, and the Kansas wind moved through the grass outside, and the house was warm and full and sound, and Dorothy Morgan, who had come to Millfield with 2 trunks and a carpetbag, and $4.30, and a reputation that someone had immediately tried to take from her, lay in the dark and felt the extraordinary, ordinary weight of a life that had turned out to be the right one. The years moved forward with the particular ease of time spent in the right place. Samuel started school, not Dorothy's school, but the new school on the north side of town that had opened when Millfield finally grew large enough to require 2. And he took to reading with the same intensity his mother brought to everything she found worth doing. Eleanor, who was by the time she was 3 clearly her own complete and particular self, and was not anyone's reflection of anyone else, had opinions about everything, and expressed them with an energy that Ezekiel observed with the quiet amusement of a man who recognizes a quality he has seen before, and who knows better than to comment on the resemblance. The Harmon house, which Dorothy had looked at in March 1884 and seen not what was there but what could be, had become by 1888 the thing she had seen. The kitchen garden was producing every year in abundance. The root cellar was well stocked and efficient. The porch railing had been fixed and fixed again, and was now entirely sound. The parlor had books on 3 walls and a piano that Dorothy had begun teaching herself to play, badly but with determination, on Sunday afternoons. Agnes Langley died in the spring of 1889, peacefully in her own bed, at 68 years old, which was a good long life for a woman who had done as much as Agnes had done. She left the house on Willow Street to Dorothy, having quietly altered her will at some point in the previous 2 years. Dorothy received the news from Frederick Langley, who delivered it with the slightly chastened air of a man who has spent several years understanding that his aunt made better decisions than he did. Dorothy kept the house on Willow Street as the tea room, which Emma now ran as co-proprietress with a younger sister she had trained herself, in a transmission of knowledge that Dorothy found entirely satisfying to observe. It provided Dorothy a steady income independent of Ezekiel's salary, which she had always maintained with the particular determination of a woman who understood that financial independence, once lost, was difficult to reclaim. On the evening they received news of Agnes's bequest, Dorothy sat on the porch in the May warmth and told Ezekiel about it, and he listened, and when she finished he said, "Agnes Langley was a remarkable woman." "She was," Dorothy agreed. "As are the women she recognized in other women," he said, which was, from Ezekiel Chandler, an elaborate compliment, and Dorothy received it as such. The town of Millfield continued its growth into the 1890s, acquiring a telegraph office and a second bank and a newspaper, the Millfield Courier, whose editor was a sharp young man from Kansas City, who quickly learned that Dorothy Chandler's opinion on civic matters was worth soliciting if you wanted to understand the actual state of things rather than the official one. Mabel Pritchard became, over the years, something that Dorothy had not expected, and which she suspected Mabel had not expected either, which was a civic ally rather than an enemy. They were never friends. Their temperaments were too different and the history between them too specific. But Mabel had a genuine talent for organization, and Dorothy had a genuine talent for execution, and on the practical committees of Millfield's civic life, these talents found ways of working alongside each other that produced results, which was, Dorothy had come to believe, the best that could be asked of most people. Mabel never mentioned the general store incident, and Dorothy never raised it. There was a tacit agreement between them, not spoken and not signed but fully understood, that the past had been what it had been, and that the present was what they had now, and that the present was more useful. In 1891, Ezekiel Chandler was elected county marshal by the residents of the county, rather than appointed by a board, which was the kind of validation that he accepted with his characteristic quiet, and Dorothy accepted with a pride she expressed loudly enough for both of them. Samuel was 7 and Alina was 4, and they celebrated their father's election with a picnic in the field behind the Harmon house in the September sun. And Samuel asked his father what being elected meant, and Ezekiel said it meant that people had decided to trust him. And Samuel thought about this with the serious, focused expression he had inherited directly from his father, and said that seemed like a very important thing. "It is," Ezekiel said, "the most important thing I know of." Dorothy watched them, her husband and her son, in the September sun, and Alina ran through the field grass ahead of them with her arms out, and the sky above Kansas was the enormous, uncomplicated blue that it always was at this time of year. And Dorothy thought of all the things she had been afraid of, and all the things that had tried to undo her, and all the things that had not succeeded, and felt the particular quality of gratitude that is not triumphant but simply deep. A gratitude that has had time to settle into the bones and becomes indistinguishable from the way you breathe. That evening, after the children were in bed, she and Ezekiel sat on the porch in the last of the September warmth with their coffee, and the stars were coming out over the Kansas prairie with the thoroughness they always brought to the work, and Ezekiel took her hand the way he always did, the large, careful hands that she knew so well now, and they watched the dark come in across the wide sky. "Ezekiel," she said. "Dorothy," he said. She looked at him with the particular seeing that years of marriage to a man you love deeply produces, the seeing that takes in not just the face and the hands but the whole of the person, the history of them, the weight of what they have chosen and what they have built and who they have become. "Do you remember what you said to me?" she asked. "That evening in September, the first one, when you came to my back door with your hat in your hands." "I said a good many things," he said. "You said you wanted to see how I was getting on," she said. "And I let you in and made coffee, and you sat at my table, and you said that what Mabel was doing was wrong." "It was," he said. "And then you came back," she said, "day after day, through the whole of that year, and you walked next to me and ate my pie and sat on my porch and took my hand and asked me to marry you and stood at the church altar and built a home with me and held our children and been the thing that I told you I thought you were that first day, the man who does the right thing." He was looking at her in the dark, very steadily. "I am exactly where I was always supposed to be," she said. "I just needed a very roundabout way of getting here." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, the gesture she knew so well and which still, after all the years, produced in her the same sensation as the first time, a warmth that moved through her from the hand all the way to the chest, where it settled with the permanence of something that has finally, fully come home. "So did I," he said. The prairie dark stretched out beyond the porch railing, enormous and full of stars and the sound of the wind in the grass, and Millfield with its lights and its people, and its decades of small and large dramas lay around them. The town that had tried to take something from Dorothy Morgan and had failed, the town that had given her, by way of the failure, everything she had not known she was looking for. Inside the house Samuel slept with the absolute confidence of a healthy boy who has no doubt that the world is orderly and that tomorrow will come as expected. Alina slept with her arms flung wide, taking up space with the easy authority she had already claimed as her birthright. The kitchen was dark and the stove was banked and the root cellar was full and the books were on the shelves and the garden was waiting for spring. And Dorothy and Ezekiel sat on the porch of the house they had made together until the night grew cool enough that they went inside, and the door closed behind them, and the light in the parlor window burned warm and steady against the dark. Years later, when Alina was old enough to ask and Samuel was old enough to remember having been told, Dorothy would tell the story of how she had come to Millfield with 2 trunks and $4.30, and how a woman had tried to ruin her with a lie, and how a man had walked into a room and stopped it cold with nothing more than a look, and how that look had changed everything. Was he frightening? Eleanor would ask, because Eleanor was the one who asked questions like that. Not to me, Dorothy would say. He never frightened me. What he had was not the kind of thing that frightens people. It was the other kind. What other kind? Dorothy would think about how to answer this in a way that a 12-year-old could understand and a 7-year-old could absorb. The kind, she would say, that makes the world feel steadier than it was before. Eleanor would file this away with the precision she brought to things that mattered, and Samuel would look at his father with the expression that was his father's expression and say nothing, because he was already beginning to understand that some things don't require words. And Ezekiel Chandler would sit at the kitchen table, which was still, after all these years, the place where the important things were said in this house, and he would look at Dorothy Morgan Chandler across the table, the woman who had come into his territory with 2 trunks and a carpetbag and more strength than she had known she possessed, the woman he had watched nearly be undone by a small and vicious act, and who had refused to be undone. The woman who had stood in the doorway of his jailhouse in March sunlight and said the word yes in a voice that had changed the shape of his entire life, and he would look at her with those dark and serious eyes that had never, in all the years she had known them, looked at her as anything other than exactly, fully, completely what she was, and she would look back, and between them the whole of it would pass wordlessly. The general store and the back gate and the November snow and the porch chairs and the creek bed and the church and the children sleeping upstairs, and the years that had come and the years still ahead, wide and open and full, stretching out like the Kansas prairie under the enormous and indifferent and magnificent sky. It was everything. It was exactly everything. And it was, after all the false starts and the hard roads and the hidden traps and the dark past, and the secrets and the betrayals and the forced choices, and the ultimate sacrifices of the self she had thought she would be for the self she had actually become, it was more than enough. It was, in the plainest and most perfect sense of the word, home.